There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how far you have walked. It is the tiredness of having been visible all day, of having held your face in the correct arrangement, of having said the right things in the right order and managed the distance between yourself and other people with the constant, low level vigilance that social existence requires. It is the tiredness of having been, for many hours, a person in the world rather than simply a person. You know this tiredness. Everyone does, though not everyone has a name for it. The travelers of Edo period Japan knew it intimately. They walked the great roads of the country, the Tokaido, the Nakasendo, the Koshu Kaido, carrying their goods and their obligations and their identities through a landscape of extraordinary beauty and ordinary hardship. And when evening came, and the light changed, and the road became less welcoming, they looked for a particular kind of light ahead, a lantern, warm, still, hung above a gate. And beneath that lantern, if they were fortunate, a woman or a man standing at the threshold of an inn, already aware of their approach, already in the process of preparing for their arrival, already, though the traveler could not yet know this, thinking about what this specific person at the end of the specific day, on this specific night of the year, would need in order to finally, genuinely rest. Tonight, you are that traveler, and tonight, someone is preparing for you. Before we step through the gate, find wherever you are right now and let it hold you. Feel the weight of the day leaving your shoulders, the way a heavy pack leaves your back when you finally set it down. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open. If the quiet adult is useful to you, consider subscribing and drop your location and local time in the comments. Knowing where in the world people are resting is one of the quiet pleasures of making this. Now, the lantern is lit, the gate is open, and the road behind you is done for tonight. The Edo period in Japan lasted from 1603 to 1868, and it produced something that has not quite existed in the world before and has not quite existed since, a culture of walking. Not walking as exercise, not walking as sport, but walking as the primary means by which an entire civilization moved itself from one place to another. The great roads of Japan during this period were among the most traveled in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people moved along them each year. Merchants carrying silk and lacquerware and rice, pilgrims on their way to and from great shrines at Ise and Nikko, government officials making the mandatory journey between their domains and the capital of Edo, artists and poets seeking the landscapes that had inspired their predecessors, ordinary people simply going, as ordinary people always have been going, from where they were to where they needed to be. The Tokaido Road alone, the Eastern Sea Road that connected Edo to Kyoto along the Pacific coast, was punctuated by 53 official post stations, each one a small town that existed largely to serve the needs of travelers, inns, tea houses, stables, the infrastructure of a walking civilization, laid out at intervals calculated to match a day's comfortable travel. A day's comfortable travel in Edo period terms was approximately 10 to 15 kilometers depending on the terrain, the weather, and the weight you were carrying. This is not very far by modern standards. It is a considerable distance that when you are carrying everything you need on your back, when the road is unpaved and the subject to the full creative hostility of Japanese weather, and when you've been doing it for multiple consecutive days. By the time the typical traveler reached the inn at the evening, they had been walking for 6 to 10 hours. Their feet, in straw sandals that wore through quickly and were replaced at roadside stalls, were sore. Their legs carried the specific ache of sustained effort over varied terrain. Their backs held the accumulated weight of a day's carrying. Their skin was marked by the day's weather, sun or rain or wind or the particular grinding of dust of a dry road in summer. But as we noted at the beginning, none of this was the deepest tiredness. Travel in Edo period Japan was not only physically demanding, it was socially complex. The rigid hierarchy of the period meant that every encounter on the road required careful navigation, the correct degree of deference to those above you in the social order, the correct degree of authority toward those below. Merchants who were technically at the bottom of the official social hierarchy but possessed considerable practical power. Samurai who were technically at the top but whose actual circumstances varied enormously. Priests and pilgrims who occupied a different kind of authority altogether. Strangers whose status was not immediately readable and whose misreading could have consequences. Every day on the road was a sustained performance of social identity. Every inn, every tea house, every chance encounter required the traveler to be precisely and correctly whoever they were in the world until the gate. This is what the inn offered that the road could not. Not merely shelter, not merely food, not merely a surface to sleep on. The inn offered the suspension of the road's demands, a temporary but genuine release from the performance of social identity, a space in which the exhausted, road worn, socially depleted self could be, for the hours of the night, something simpler and more essential than their position in the world. The inns of Edo period ranged enormously in quality and character. At one end, the grand Honjin inns, reserved for daimyo lords and high officials, vast complexes with formal gardens, multiple reception rooms, and retinues of staff trained to serve the most exacting standards of aristocratic hospitality. At the other end, the humble Kichiendo, the cheapest lodging houses where travelers slept crowded together on shared futons and provided their own food. But it is the middle ground that interests us tonight. The ordinary ryokan, the inn of the merchant class, the prosperous farmer, the working pilgrim, where the hospitality was genuine without being grand, where the preparation for each guest's rest was taken seriously without being ceremonial, where the innkeeper knew the road and its demands from long experience and had developed over years of watching tired people arrive at the gate a precise and practical understanding of what the human body and the human spirit required after a day of sustained effort in the world. These innkeepers were not aristocrats. They were not philosophers, though some of them were. They were practical people with the practical skill, the skill of receiving, of taking in, of making a space so correctly prepared for rest that the guest, stepping through the gate, felt something happen in their body before they had consciously registered anything at all. A loosening, a slowing, the beginning of a release that the road had not permitted on only this, specifically this, could provide. Tonight, you are arriving at one of these inns. The sun is an hour from setting. The light is the amber gold of a Japanese autumn evening, the kind of light that makes everything it touches, the tiled rooftops, the cedar gates, the dust of the road, look briefly and undeservedly beautiful. You have been walking since before dawn. Your sandals need replacing. Your shoulders ache. Ahead, a lantern, warm, still, hung above a gate of dark cedar wood. The gate is the first ritual. In Japanese architecture and in Japanese thought, the threshold, the the space between one condition and another, is not merely a physical feature, it is a conceptual one. The gate of a Japanese inn is not simply the point at which the outside ends and the inside begins. It is the point at which one kind of selfhood ends and another becomes possible. You push the gate open. It is heavy cedar, the dark wood darkened by decades of weather and handling, its grain raised slightly by years of rain. The hinges are iron, worn smooth, and the gate moves with a weight and deliberateness that feels appropriate. This is not a door that swings easily, not a threshold that can be crossed without intention. Beyond the gate, a small courtyard. Stone pavers, irregular and dark, laid in a pattern that is not quite symmetrical. The Edo aesthetic that distrusted perfect symmetry, finding in its slight imperfections something closer to the truth of natural things. Between the pavers, moss, deep green, soft, the kind of green that seems to generate its own light in low conditions. A stone basin at the edge of the courtyard holds water, its surface trembling very slightly from a thin stream that enters from a bamboo spout above. The sound of that water. It is the first thing the inn gives you. Before you have been greeted, before you have been shown to your room, before any of the considered preparations that await you inside, the sound of water falling into a stone basin in a small courtyard tells the part of your nervous system that has been managing the road all day that the road is done, that it is permitted now to begin the process of release. Sound is faster than thought. The body responds to the sound of falling water before the mind has processed what it is hearing. Something in the automatic nervous system, something older than language, older than the social self that the road demanded, recognizes the sound and responds to it, slows, softens, begins almost imperceptibly to let go. The Edo period innkeeper understood this, not in the neurological vocabulary that a modern sleep researcher would use, but in the practical vocabulary of long observation. They knew that a guest who crossed the threshold into the sound of falling water arrived differently than a guest who crossed into silence or noise. They knew that the sound of water in the garden was not decorative, it was functional. It was the first act of hospitality, the first gentle intervention on behalf of the arriving body. You stand in the courtyard for a moment, your pack still on your back, the gate closed behind you. The road noise has almost completely disappeared. This too is deliberate. The placement of the gate, the height of the surrounding walls, the arrangement of plantings along the inner perimeter, all of it calculated to reduce the noise of the street and the town to something distant and irrelevant. Inside this gate, a different acoustic world, quieter, more intimate, oriented around the sound of water and the sound of wind in the bamboo at the courtyard's far edge. Then a sliding door opens at the far side of the courtyard. Warm light spills across the stone pavers, and a figure appears at the entrance of the inn, the proprietress, or some inn's her husband, or an apprentice trained to perform this specific greeting, and bows. The bow is deep, not perfunctory, not the brief nod of acknowledgement that passes for greetings in a busy establishment. This is a bow that takes time, that requires the one giving it to be genuinely present, to have stopped whatever they were doing and giving the arriving traveler their full attention. Iraishamase, welcome, come in, you are received. Three syllables in the mouth of a skilled innkeeper, spoken at the right moment, with the right quality of attention, carried more genuine hospitality than a paragraph of formal greeting. Not because of what the word meant exactly, but because of what their delivery communicated. I was expecting you. I was preparing for you. Your arrival is not an interruption. It is what this place exists for. You remove your sandals at the step, the genkan, the entry threshold, one of the most important ritual spaces in Japanese domestic architecture. The removal of footwear at the threshold is one of the oldest and most consistent elements of Japanese spatial practice, and its significance extends well beyond the practical. Shoes carry the road, the dust of the road, the contact of the road, the social demands of the road. To remove them at the threshold is a physical enactment of the transition that the inn offers. To leave the road outside, to enter the inner space as something lighter and less encumbered than the person who arrived. Your sandals are taken and set aside. Clean indoor sandals are placed before you, soft, light, the wallwood warm from being kept near the entrance. You step up into the inn. The floor beneath you, your feet, is different from anything you have walked on all day. Not stone, not packed earth, not the varying surfaces of the road. Wood, warm and slightly giving, its surface polished by long use to a quality that is simultaneously smooth and alive. Your feet, sore from the hours in straw sandals, register the difference immediately. You are inside. The gate is behind you. The road is behind you. The inn has you now. The proprietress of a well run Edo Inn is one of the most skilled readers of the human beings in the world. This is not hyperbole. The art of his hospitality in Japan during this period, the practice that would eventually be codified and refined into what we know today as omotenashi, was understood as a genuine discipline, comparable in its demands to other skilled arts. It required years of apprenticeship, continuous observation, and the development of a particular quality of attention that most people never cultivate because most contexts never require it. The attention of the skilled innkeeper was not the attention of the curious or the analytical. It was not the attention of someone gathering information in order to make a judgment. It was the attention of someone who had entirely subordinated their own perspective to the task of perceiving another person accurately and completely, seeing not what they expected to see, not what they hoped to see, but what was actually there. In the few minutes between a guest's arrival at the gate and their being shown to their room, an experienced innkeeper had already gathered an extraordinary amount of information. The way the guests moved, whether their gait was stiff or loose, whether they favored one leg, whether the tension of a long day's walking had settled into their lower back or their shoulders or both, the set of their jaw, whether the road's social demands had left them contracted and guarded, or whether the crossing of the threshold had already begun to soften them. The quality of their silence, whether it was the silence of exhaustion, the silence of private preoccupation, or the silence of someone who simply did not feel the need to fill every moment with speech. Their hands, the condition of their hands, told considerable stories. A merchant's hands looked different from a samurai's, from a pilgrim's, from a government's officials, and differences were not merely the obvious class markers, but subtler things, the specific distribution of callus, the particular quality of fatigue in the knuckles, the way the fingers held themselves when the hand was at rest. Their eyes, whether they looked around the inn's entrance with the active curiosity of someone encountering the place for the first time, or the dull automatic survey of someone who had stayed in too many inns to find any of them interesting, whether they were anxiety in them, the anxiety of someone who had been traveling alone in the unfamiliar territory and had not yet allowed themselves to believe that the night would be safe, whether there was grief or relief or the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavier than a pack. All of this was observed, processed, and acted upon without the guest being aware of any of it. This is what the Edo period writers who documented in culture meant when they described the ideal innkeeper as someone who served without being seen to serve, whose care was so accurately directed that it arrived as naturally as the right temperature of air, as something the environment simply provided rather than something another person had worked to supply. On this night, the innkeeper looks at you. You do not notice the looking. You are aware only of being received, of the warmth of the entrance, the low light of the paper lanterns, the small cedar and faint sweetness of hinoki cypress, and something cooking somewhere in the inn's interior that you cannot yet identify, but that your body has already responded to with a quiet, involuntary relaxation of the stomach. But the innkeeper sees you completely and accurately in the way that only genuine attention permits. She sees the specific quality of your tiredness, not the dramatic exhaustion of someone at their limit, but the deep, cumulative fatigue of someone who has been functioning at a high level for many consecutive hours and whose reserves are not gone but are genuinely depleted. She sees that you are carrying something in your face, not grief exactly, but the residue of a day that required more of you than an ordinary day. She sees that your shoulders are up around your ears in a way that you are almost certainly not aware of. She does not comment on any of this. She does not ask how you are feeling or what kind of day you have had. These questions, well intentioned, would require you to produce a social performance in response, to assemble the day into a narrative suitable for sharing with a stranger, to manage her reaction to whatever you said, to be, once again, a person in relationship with another person rather than simply a person being held. Instead, she notes what she has seen and she adjusts silently and completely every preparation she has already begun to make on your behalf. The bath will be slightly hotter than standard tonight because she had seen the specific quality of muscular tension that responds best to heat rather than warmth. The meal will be lighter than she might otherwise have offered because she has seen that your appetite is dulled by fatigue rather than sharpened by it. The room will be prepared with the sliding screens slightly more closed than usual because she had seen that you need more enclosure tonight, more of the inn's specific quality of being held, and less of the beautiful garden view that the other guests might have wanted. None of this will be explained to you. It will simply be true. The night will simply be correctly prepared, and you will sleep in a way that you could not have predicted when you arrived at the gate. And in the morning, you will feel restored in a way that seems, in retrospect, almost mysterious, as though the inn itself had known what you needed without being told. This is the art. This is what the best innkeepers of the Edo period spent their lives learning. Not the management of a building, not the logistics of feeding and housing strangers, but something closer to what a doctor does when diagnosis is working well, or what a musician does when accompaniment is working well. The subordination of the self to accurate perception of another, and the translation of that perception into action so precisely calibrated that its recipient is not aware of receiving anything at all. Just the result, just the rest, just the morning and feeling of having been overnight pulled back together. You are shown to your room by a young apprentice who carries your pack with both hands as though it is a gift rather than a burden, and sets it down in the corner of your room with a care that communicates, without words, that your belongings are valued in this place. But before the room, the bath. In a well run Edo period inn, the order of things mattered. The bath did not come after dinner or before sleep or at a time convenient to the schedule of the establishment. The bath came first because the bath was understood as the necessary precondition for everything that followed, not a luxury, not a comfort offered to the guests at the end of the sequence of services. The first act, the thing without which rest could not properly begin. The bathhouse of the inn, the the onsen, or in simpler establishments, a large wooden tub in a dedicated room, was kept at a specific temperature that had been calibrated over years of observation, hot enough to be genuinely transformative, hot enough that the first moment of immersion required a conscious act of acceptance, a decision to surrender to the heat rather than to resist it. Not so hot as to be punishing or to require endurance rather than allowing release. The tub was made of hinoki cypress. This was not merely traditional. Hinoki has a specific smell, clean, slightly sweet, resinous in a way that is not heavy but is somehow deeply reassuring, like the smell of a forest after rain, but more intimate, more domestic. The smell of hinoki in steam is one of the most consistently calming olfactory experiences available to the human nervous system. And the Edo period innkeeper knew this not from any scientific analysis, but from watching hundreds of guests lower themselves into hinoki baths and observing what happened to their faces. What happened was they released, not all at once, not immediately. The release happened in stages, each one visible, each one distinct, each one representing the dissolution of one other layer of the road's accumulated demands. The first stage was physical. The hot water reached the muscles that had been sustaining effort all day, the calves, the thighs, the lower back, the shoulders, and those muscles, meeting heat, began the process of letting go. This was not comfortable exactly in the first minutes. Tissue that has been contracted for many hours does not release without some sensation. There was a quality of ache to it, a productive ache, the ache of something being worked out rather than something being damaged. The second stage was the breath. Something happened to the breath in the first few minutes of the hot bath that no amount of deliberate breathing practice could quite replicate. The steam and the heat and the pressure of the water on the chest created a breathing pattern that was slower and deeper than the walking breath, than the social breath, than the breath of someone managing themselves in the world. It became, gradually and without effort, the breath of someone who had temporarily stopped managing anything. The third stage, and this is the one that the skilled innkeeper watched for, the one that told her the bath was doing its work, was the face. A face in the road, in the social world, in the sustained performance of a daily identity, holds a particular configuration, not a grimace, not a mask, nothing so obvious or so dramatic, simply the subtle arrangement of muscles that hold the face in the correct presentation of the world it is moving through. The slight tension around the eyes, the managed quality of the mouth, the forehead that is not furrowed but is not quite relaxed either, that is held in a state of alert readiness that has become so habitual it is no longer felt as tension. In the bath, after the first stage and the second stage has done their work, this configuration dissolved, the forehead smoothed, the area around the eyes released, the jaw especially, which in most adults carries a chronic tension so consistent it has become invisible, unclenched itself and dropped just very slightly, the teeth no longer touching, the hinge of it finding a position that required no muscular effort to maintain. The face in the bath became the face of a person who's not performing anything. It is a beautiful thing to see in another person, and Edo innkeepers who described their work in the letters and diaries that had survived spoke of with a reverence that was not sentimental, but was simply accurate. The recognition of something genuine being allowed to be genuine, of the human being behind the social person briefly and completely visible. You sit in the bath. The water is exactly the right temperature. This does not surprise you, though it should. The exactly right temperature is not a simple thing to achieve. It requires knowledge of what the arriving body needs, which varies by season, by weather, by the specific quality of exhaustion in the guest has brought with them. Tonight, the water is hot enough to feel like a decision, and the decision feels correct. You lower yourself in. The heat arrives at your feet first, then your calves, then the long muscles of your thigh, then your lower back. Your lower back, which has been quietly complaining since mid afternoon, and which now, in the water, makes a sound that is not quite a sound, a sensation that is almost a sigh, as someone long held begins its slow release. The steam smells of hinoki. It is the smell of trees, of wood, of something made from living material that retains some quality of the life it came from, even after it has been shaped and dried and made into a vessel for human use. You breathe it, and something in you that has nothing to do with the rational mind responds, opens slightly, the way a hand opens when it is warm enough and safe enough to stop being a fist. You close your eyes. Outside the bathhouse, through the thin wooden walls, you can hear the inn going about its evening, the distant sound of something being arranged in the kitchen, a soft footstep on the wooden corridor, the sound of the water garden, still present, slightly more muffled now, but still audible, still saying what it has been saying since you arrived at the gate. You stay in the bath far longer than you intended. This is also deliberate, not yours, but the innkeeper's. The bath has been made in such a way that leaving it requires more active intention than staying. The temperature is exactly the threshold where discomfort has not yet arrived to prompt departure. The steam is consistent. The light in the bathhouse is low and warm and does not create any visual demand that would pull the mind toward activity. You stay until the hot water has done everything it came to do, until the muscles have said what they needed to say and had been heard, until the breath had found its own depth, until the face has become fully and without reservation the face of someone who is no longer on the road. You emerge from the bath in a yukata, a light cotton robe provided by the inn, clean, soft, its fabric washed so many times that it has lost any stiffness and now moves with you rather than against you. It is no longer your clothing, it is the inn's clothing, worn by every guest who has passed through, washed between each use, carrying in its fibers no residue of identity or role or social position. In the yukata, you are simply a person at rest, not a merchant, not a samurai, not a pilgrim, not whatever the road required you to be today. Simply a person in a soft robe in a warm inn at the end of a day's walking, moving through a corridor of polished wood toward a room where something has been prepared for you. The corridor of smells of cedar and something from the kitchen, the smell of dashi, the foundational broth of Japanese cooking, made from kombu, seaweed, and kotsuo bushi, dried and fermented tuna flakes. It is one of the most ancient and most distinctive smells in the world, and it does something particular to the appetite. Not the sharp, demanding hunger that strong spices produce, but a gentle awakening of the appetite, a quiet suggestion of that the body, which has been focused outward all day on the demands of the road, might now turn its attention inward. The meal in a well run Edo period inn was not merely food, it was a sequence, a carefully considered progression of flavors, temperatures, textures, and presentations that was designed not only to nourish, but to guide the guest from the state of the road, alert, defended, outward facing, to the state of the night, quiet, inward, receptive. The sequence began with something small and precise, not dramatic opening course meant to impress, a small dish of pickled vegetables, tsukamano, their sharp, clean acidity cutting through whatever the road had left on the palate. A tiny cup of warm tea, not the robust tea of the tea house, but something lighter, gentler, the tea of a domestic interior rather than a social space. Then the soup, always the soup early, always warm, always made with the dashi you could smell in the corridor. The miso soup of an Edo inn was not complicated. Tofu, cut into small cubes that had taken on the character of the broth around them. Perhaps a few leaves of wakame seaweed, soft and dark, their texture somewhere between substantial and dissolving. A garnish of finely cut spring onion, green against the pale broth. The bowl itself, lacquered wood, warm in the hands, its warmth arriving in the palms before the mouth has tasted anything. The warmth in the hands. This is worth staying with for a moment. The hands carrying attention in a way the body is not aware of. The grip of the day, the maintained readiness of the hands holds even when they have nothing to grip, the subtle preparation for action that persists long after action has ceased to be required. To hold a warm bowl of soup with both hands in the way that Japanese eating culture prescribed, not as a rule, but as a natural consequence of the bowl's size and the quality of its warmth, was to give the hands something genuinely satisfying to do, something that required a light, open hold rather than a grip, something that rewarded the hands for releasing. After the soup, rice. In the Edo period, rice was not a side dish or a starch to be eaten alongside more interesting things. It was the center, the thing around which the meal was arranged, the thing that the other dishes existed to accompany. Good inn rice was cooked with a specific timing relative to the guest's arrival, not so early that it had dried and hardened, not so late that it was not ready when needed. The timing of the rice was one of the small demonstration of the innkeeper's attention, visible to a guest who knew enough to notice it, and invisible, as the best hospitality always is, to a guest who simply found that things were always right. Fish, grilled over charcoal, the skin crisped to a delicate fragility that shattered at the touch of chopsticks, the flesh beneath moist and clean tasting. In the inland inns of the mountain routes, river fish ayu, the sweet fish, its flesh faintly sweet, as its name suggested. Along the coastal roads, something from the sea, its flavor carrying a memory of salt water and depth. The fish was not elaborate. It was not transformed beyond the recognition by the application of many flavors. It was fish, cooked correctly, served at the right moment. The sequence continued, small dishes, precisely made, each one different in flavor and texture from the last, each one present in a quantity that was sufficient without being excessive, each one requiring the eater to be genuinely present to it rather than consuming it mechanically. This is the quality that most distinguishes Edo period inn cooking from the food of the road, from the food of the tea house, from the quick fuel of the traveling life. It required presence. Each dish was small enough and complete enough that you had to actually encounter it, taste it, register it, finish it before moving to the next. The meal could not be eaten in distraction. It could not be consumed as background activity. It asked for your attention, and in asking for your attention, it gave your attention something worthy of itself. Scholars of Japanese food culture had noted that this quality, the requiring of presence, was understood by Edo period innkeepers as a function rather than aesthetic preference. They knew, empirically if not theoretically, that the guest who ate in presence fell asleep more readily and slept more deeply than the guest who ate quickly and without attention. The meal was not merely nourishment, it was the second act of preparation for sleep, as the bath had been for the first. You eat slowly. This comes naturally here in a way that it might not elsewhere. The room is quiet. The portions are sized correctly for attention. The sequence of flavors keeps arriving in ways that are satisfying but not overwhelming, familiar but not boring. You find yourself eating with an awareness of each mouthful that you do not typically bring to eating, tasting each thing fully before reaching for the next, pausing between bites, settling down your chopsticks while you chew. The meal ends with something sweet, a small piece of wagashi, the traditional Japanese confection made from bean paste and sugar, its flavor clean and quiet, the sweetness a gentle completion rather than a rich indulgence. Another cup of tea, slightly different from the first, warmer, slightly more full bodied, the kind of tea that the body recognizes as a signal for a different quality of time, slower time, time in which nothing is required. You sit for a while after the meal, not because you are waiting for anything, but because the room, the quiet and the warmth of the tea that in your hands have produced a quality of stillness that moving would interrupt unnecessarily. The apprentice clears the dishes without asking, with the timing of someone who has watched the meal carefully and knows that it is finished without being told. She refills your tea. She does this from a position slightly to the side and slightly behind you, so the act of the service does not require you to turn your head, does not interrupt the line of your gaze, does not demand any social acknowledgement. The tea is warm, the room is quiet, the inn has you still. The room has been prepared for before your arrival. This is one of the things worth understanding about the Edo period inn. The preparation was not a response to your presence, it was an anticipation of it. The innkeeper had known from the booking made days earlier, or from the arrival of the travelers at the gate, approximately what to prepare. But the adjustment, the fine calibration of the room to the specific person who would sleep in it, happened in the window between your arrival and the moment you entered the room. In the time you were in the bath, In the time you were eating, someone had been in your room, attending to it, making the small changes the innkeeper's initial reading you had indicated. The room was a washitsu, a traditional Japanese room, and its basic elements were consistent across the inn tradition. Tatami mats on the floor, their woven rush surface releasing a faint green smell when warm, a smell that modern Japanese people associate so strongly with rest and home that it functions almost as a scent of memory for every childhood nap and every quiet afternoon. A tokonoma, an alcove in one wall where a single object was placed, a scroll, a small ceramic vessel, a branch of whatever was flowering or bare or otherwise remarkable about the current season, a paper screen door, the shoji, through which light filtered in a quality that was never harsh, never direct, always the softened, diffuse light of paper. The room was small, deliberately, correctly, precisely small, not small as a limitation, not small because the inn lacked space, but small because the Edo period understanding of sleep and rest had been identified through long observation that the human body and the human spirit settled into rest more readily in an enclosed, intimate space than in a large, open one. The human need for enclosure during sleep is ancient, long before the in tradition codified it, long before the Japanese aesthetic philosophy of Ma gave it a theoretical framework. Human beings had been curling into small spaces to sleep, seeking the particular quality of safety that comes from having the walls closed, from knowing that nothing can approach from an unexpected direction, from the bodily sense of being held that only an intimate space provides. The Edo period innkeeper understood this not as theory but as practice. She knew that a guest who felt exposed, whose room was too large, whose screens were too open, whose sleeping space lacked the quality of enclosure, would lie awake longer and sleep less deeply than a guest who felt held. And so the room was made the right size. The screens were adjusted. The space was calibrated to the ancient need. On the tokonoma shelf tonight, a single branch of autumn maple, three leaves, deep red, attached to a slender branch of dark wood, placed in a narrow ceramic vase, the branch slightly tilted, the composition asymmetrical in the way the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi prescribed, imperfect, impermanent, incomplete, and therefore closer to the truth of things than any perfect arrangement could be. You look at the branch for a moment, three leaves, red against the pale wall of the tokonoma. You do not think of anything in particular about it, but looking at it, you find that your eyes soften, that the quality of focus with which you have been looking at the world all day, the sharp, evaluating, information gathering look of a person navigating a road, relaxes into something less directed and more receptive. This is what the tokonoma was for. Not decoration in the Western sense of decoration. It's not something to fill the wall, not something to demonstrate taste or wealth or aesthetic sophistication. A single object chosen with care for this specific moment in the season and this specific quality of the evening, placed in the room to give the guest's eyes somewhere to rest that required nothing of them, a focal point without demands, a place for the gaze to land and soften. The charcoal brazier in the corner of the room, the hibachi, had been lit 2 hours before your arrival, not to create warmth as so much to create the anticipation of warmth, to ensure that when you entered the room, the air would have already carried the specific quality of charcoal heat, dry and even and present in the way that radiant heat is present, felt on the skin before it registers as temperature. The screen to the garden was open a precise amount, not wide, not closed, but open enough to admit the sound of the garden and a thread of cool night air that played against the warmth of the brazier, creating the specific thermal environment that the Edo period sleeping tradition had identified as optimal, warm in the body of the room, with a thread of coolness at a face level that would deepen through the night as the brazier banked itself. You stand in the room for a moment before doing anything at all, just standing, feeling the tatami under the thin soles of your indoor sandals, the slight give of the rush matting, the faint smell of it, the specific quality of this floor that it is neither hard nor soft, but something else entirely, a surface that is both firm and yielding, that accepts the weight of the standing body without either resisting it or disappearing beneath it. Outside the garden, something moves in the dark garden, not an animal. Wind in the bamboo, the specific sound of bamboo in a light wind, which is unlike any other sound made by any other plant in any other wind. A dry, delicate, complex sound, each stem and leaf contributing its particular note to an improvised music that is never the same twice and never needs to be. You listen to the bamboo. The room is correct. The futon has been laid while you were eating. This was the final act of room preparation, saved until the meal was underway so that by the time the guest returned to the room, the sleeping surface would be precisely at the right temperature, the layers settled into the right relationship with each other, the whole arrangement ready. The futon is not a mattress in the Westminster sense of the word. It does not sit on a frame, does not elevate the sleeper above the floor, does not attempt to replicate the experience of floating. A futon lies on the tatami directly, raising the sleeper only slightly above the floor, maintaining a fundamental relationship between the sleeping body and the ground beneath it that elevates the bed's interrupt. The Edo period futon consisted of several layers. The shikibuton, the lower mattress, was filled with cotton batting, thick enough to insulate the body from the floor, but not so thick as to create a sensation of elevation. Above it, a sheet of fine cotton. Then the kake futon, the upper cover, filled with the best quality cotton wadding the inn could afford, its outer surface made of silk in the grander inns or fine cotton in more modest ones, its weight calibrated to the season. The weight of the futon cover matters. This is something that modern sleep research has recently begun to document. The calming effect of appropriate weight on the sleeping body, the way the sensation of being held by something with physical substance activates the body's rest response in a way that lighting coverings do not. The Edo period innkeeper had observed this effect for centuries before it acquired scientific explanation. She knew that the guest who slept under a correctly weighted futon slept differently, more deeply, with less movement, waking less frequently than the guest whose covering was too light. The futon had been aired that day. This was a daily practice in the well-run inn. Futons carried outside in the morning to the wooden rails of the inn's outer corridor, spread in the sun and the air for several hours, brought back inside before the evening chill arrived. The airing did several things. It reduced moisture. It reduced the microscopic inhabitants that accumulate in any fabric regularly slapped in, and it gave the futon a quality that the Japanese called hino nioi, the smell of the sun. The smell of the sun in fabric is one of the most universally recognized comfort scents available to the human nose. Almost every culture that has ever dried cloth in sunlight, this smell has been associated with cleanliness and warmth and the specific reassurance of something freshly prepared. And in the inn, it was the smell of care, of someone having attended to this specific thing on this specific day so that tonight it would be this clean and warm and carrying the memory of a day's sunlight into the cold of the night. You kneel beside the futon for a moment before lying down, not out of ceremony, but from the specific posture that the low Japanese room encourages. The floor is where the things happen in this room. The floor is where you eat, where you sit, and where you prepare for sleep. The low ceiling and the intimate scale of the room create a gravitational pull toward the floor that is very different from the pull of a bed in a high ceilinged Western room. The floor here does not feel like falling, it feels like arriving. You lie down. The shikibuton beneath you is firm but not hard, present without demanding. The kakefuton settles over you with a weight that is immediately and precisely right, heavy enough to be felt as a presence, light enough to move you with you, warm enough to begin immediately the work of releasing the last reserves of muscular tension that the bath and the meal had not yet reached. The pillow is harder than what most modern people use. A traditional Japanese pillow, the makura, was designed not to sink beneath the head, but to support it at a specific angle relative to the spine. This was understood as health practice as well as a sleeping practice. A neck held in correct alignment through the night was a neck that woke without the specific stiffness that came from hours of twisted or compressed sleep. The pillow was sometimes filled with buckwheat husks, sobagara, which gave it a density and a faint sound when you moved, a slight rustling as the husks shifted and settled, not a disruptive sound, a very small, very intimate sound, the sound of something small reorganizing itself around your specific shape, taking an impression of you and holding it. You adjust slightly and the pillow adjusts with you. The futon cover is warm. The tatami below you is present and still. The room is the right size. The hibachi is the corner burns without drama. This is the nature of charcoal heat. It does not perform, it does not crackle or spark or draw the eye with the visual interest of an open fire. It simply produces heat steadily and continuously, its surface glowing a deep amber red that is visible only in the dark, and in the dim light of the papered lamp it is barely perceptible as anything but warmth. The charcoal used in the better Edo period inns was binchotan, white charcoal made from ubame oak through a specific high temperature firing process that produced a fuel of extraordinary density and purity. Bingchotan burns hotter, longer, and more cleanly than ordinary charcoal. It produces almost no smoke. It gives off an even dry heat that does not create the humidity that wood fire generates. And it is said by those who work with it to have an effect on the air around it, a specific quality that the Japanese associate with the concept of ki, the vital energy that flows through all living things and through well made objects. Whether or not the Binkotan was measurable electromagnetic or infrared properties different from other fuels, a claim that has been made and disputed by researchers. Its practical effect in the sleeping room is real and consistent. The air in the room, heated by Binkotan, has a quality that air heated by other means does not quite replicate, a dryness that does not feel arid, an evenness of temperature that does not feel artificial, a warmth that seems to belong to the room rather than being imported into it. The innkeeper had judged the amount of charcoal in the hibachi with care. Too much and the room would grow too warm in the middle of the night, producing the specific discomfort of a body that is too hot to sleep and cannot cool itself because it is enclosed. Too little, and the charcoal would burn out before dawn, allowing the cold of the autumn night to enter the room during the most vulnerable hours of sleep. The right amount would produce heat through the night that declined gradually, following the body's own declining temperature through the sleep cycle, so the room became cooler as the night deepened and the body needed less external heat to maintain its core temperature. This calibration, the amount of charcoal matched to the length of the night and the current season, was a skill that took years to develop, and the experienced innkeeper performed without calculation from the kind of embodied knowledge that exists below the level of conscious reasoning. You are aware of the hibachi's warmth from the futon, not as heat exactly, not as something pressing against you, more as an absence of cold, a quality of the air in the room that means you do not have to do anything to maintain warmth. You do not have to curl tighter, pull the futon closer, brace against anything. The room is managing itself on your behalf, and the only thing required of you is to be present in it. Outside, the autumn night is cold. The temperature has dropped significantly since dusk. The Japanese autumn night is not the lingering warmth of tropical evenings, but a clean, sharp cold that carries the smell of coming winter, of bare branches and cold soil, and the particular freshness of mountain air moving south. You can feel this cold air at this thin thread of space where the garden screen is not quite closed, a line of slightly cooler air at face level, like a finger of night touching your cheek. This is correct. The coolness at your face tells your body something it needs to know, that the night is doing what nights do, and that the world beyond the futon is appropriately cold, that the warmth you are lying in is a specific and valued condition rather than simply the ambient temperature of everything. Without the coolness at your face, the warmth of the futon would become invisible, taken for granted, losing the quality that makes it genuinely comforting. Contrast is the mechanism of perception. The inn is warm because the outside is cold. The futon is soft because the tatami is firm. The silence of the room is meaningful because the road was loud. Every quality of this night is enhanced by its opposite, and the Edo period inn had arranged these opposites with the precision of a musician arranging harmonics, so that each element deepened the effects of the others, so that the whole was more than sum of its parts. The hibachi glows very quietly, very steadily. The charcoal will burn until long after you are asleep, and when you wake in the morning room will have cooled gracefully. The charcoal long spins spent, the air carrying only the faint residue of the night's warmth like a scent that has not quite left. The Edo peered in garden was not decorative in any simple sense. This is the central misunderstanding that most modern visitors to traditional Japanese inns bring with them. The idea that the garden is an aesthetic amenity, something to look and appreciate, something that adds visual pleasure to the experience of staying. This is true, but it is not the whole truth, and is not the deepest truth. The garden of the inn was, among its other functions, a sound installation, a carefully composed arrangement of sonic elements designed to provide exactly the quality of auditory environment that the sleeping human nervous system requires. Complex enough to occupy the pattern seeking, anxiety generating part of the mind, organic enough to signal safety, varied enough to prevent boredom, quiet enough to permit sleep. The elements were chosen and placed with this function in mind. Running water, a stream or a bamboo sprout into a stone basin provided the continuous aperiodic sound that the brain classifies as white noise, information dense enough to mask more alarming sounds, irregular enough to avoid the hyperregularity the brain finds frustrating and alerting, low enough in frequency to be genuinely calming rather than merely masking. Bamboo. The sound of bamboo in wind is one of the most complex and most beautiful natural sounds available in the Japanese climate, and the Edo period garden designers placed it deliberately near sleeping rooms, knowing that its sound, dry, delicate, never repeating exactly, would occupy the mind's pattern seeking function without overstimulating it. Listening to bamboo in wind is like listening to improvised music in a language you almost understand. Your mind reaches toward it and never quite grasps it and its contents, somehow not to grasp it. Pine trees. The sound of wind in pine is lower and more continuous than the sound of bamboo, a sustained note that varied in intensity with the wind's strength but never entirely ceased. Pine in the night's garden was the bass note of the inn's sonic composition, the foundation against which the higher, more complex sounds of bamboo and water played. And sometimes, in the most carefully considered inn gardens, a deer scatter the shishi odoshi placed near the stream. This was a length of bamboo pivoted at its center, positioned beneath a stream of water that filled one end until the weight tipped it, emptying with a knock against a stone before rising to refill. The sound was intermittent and variable. Silence, the sound of water filling, then the knock, then silence again. The interval between knocks was never exactly the same because the flow of water was never exactly constant. The deer scarer's knock was against the stone was, in the inn's sonic vocabulary, the sound of time, not metered time, not the regular beat of a clock, but organic time, the kind of time that exists in natural processes, in the growth of plants, in the movement of water, in the cycles of breathing and heartbeat, irregular enough to be living, consistent enough to be reassuring, the sound of something working quietly and continuously in the night on the other side of the paper screen. You lie in the futon and listen. The garden is doing what it was designed to do. The water is continuous, low, aperiodic. The boom bamboo moves in a wind so light you could not feel it on your skin, but that it is sufficient to stir the lightest stems, producing a sound that is mostly silence with small moments of delicate complexity threaded through it. Somewhere in the garden, a frog, not a chorus, a single frog, brief and decisive, then silence, then again, from a slightly different position, a different note, then silence. Matsuo Basho, the great haiku poet of the 17th century, wrote of a frog jumping into an old pond, the sound of water, the interruption of silence, the silence returning. He was not writing about frogs, he was writing about the nature of time, the nature of awareness, the relationship between stillness and the brief events that make stillness perceptible. He was writing about exactly this, the garden at night, the single frog, the returning silence. You are not thinking about any of this. You are simply listening. Your mind, which has been generating thoughts continuously before dawn, the logistics of the road, the management of encounters, the calculation of distances and times and social situations, is finding in the garden sound something it can attend to without effort and without agenda. This is the final preparation. Everything else, the bath, the meal, the correctly sized room, the correctly weighted futon, the charcoal warmth, has been preparing your body. The garden prepares your mind, gives it a sound world rich enough to inhabit and gentle enough to release its grip on the day's concerns, allows the analytical, problem solving, self managing function to exhale and let something quieter take over. That something quieter that takes over is what sleep requires. Not unconsciousness exactly, that will come, but this first, the mind in a state of open, unclenched receptivity, not directed at anything, not avoiding anything, simply present to the sound of water and bamboo and the occasional frog and the very distant, very faint sound of the inn going about its last business of the evening. The lamp in the room has been turned very low. The paper screen glows faintly, the garden barely visible through its shapes and shadows. The hibachi in the corner is a suggestion of warmth. The futon is present and correct. The garden sounds, the water falls, the bamboo breathes. The history of the Japanese inn is better documented than almost any comparable institution in the world, for the simple reason that the Edo period produced an extraordinary volume of written material about travel. Travel literature was one of the most dominant literary forms of the period. Poets and artists produced accounts of their journeys that were read and circulated widely. Government officials kept meticulous records of inns that where they stayed, the meals that were served, and the quality of the bath and the futon and the morning gruel. Merchants maintained diaries that recorded every inn along every route, their assessments often specific enough to constitute something close to a rating system. And the inns themselves kept records, registers of guests, their names, their status, their origin and destination were required by the Tokugawa government as part of its comprehensive system of population monitoring. These registers have survived in considerable numbers, and from them, historians have been able to reconstruct in remarkable detail the pattern of travel and the economics of hospitality along the great roads. What is somewhat more contested is the question of how universal the standards of care had been describing this evening actually were. The idealized picture of the Edo period inn, the attentive proprietress, the perfectly calibrated bath, the thoughtfully prepared room, is drawn primarily from the accounts of middle and upper class travelers who could afford the better establishments and who had the literary education to describe what they experienced. The reality for lower class travelers was considerably more variable. The Quincionado, the cheapest lodging houses, sometimes called bed sharing inns, provided a roof and a shared sleeping space and little else. Guests brought their own food or went without. The futon, where one existed, was shared between multiple people. The bath, if available, was a large wooden tub that multiple guests used in succession, the water growing progressively less clean and less hot through the evening. Historians would have studied the period's travel accounts note that the gap between the best and worst accommodation available on the Edo roads was roughly comparable to the gap between a fine modern hotel and a subway bench, both technically shelter, but representing entirely different relationships between the establishment and the well being of the person staying there. There is also an ongoing debate about the role of the female innkeeper, the okami, in the development of the hospitality tradition. Some scholars argue that the particular qualities associated with the best Edo period innkeeping, the attention of the whole guest, the care for the body as well as the social person, the interest in sleep and the rest as outcomes being to be actively pursued rather than simply allowed, were specifically and importantly the contribution of women to a tradition that had been previously been more transactional. Others push back on this reading, arguing that it romanticizes a social role that was in practice one of considerable labor and frequent hardship, that the innkeeper who appeared to float effortlessly through the evening provided perfectly calibrated hospitality was in reality working a 16-hour day, managing a complex household economy, navigating the demands of guests whose social status required careful deference, and sleeping, when she slept at all, less well than any of the guests she had been spent the day preparing for. The debate circles around a real tension in the historical record, the gap between the ideal Edo period hospitality as it was articulated in the literary tradition and the material reality of the lives of the people who provided it. Both things are true. The ideal was genuine, the care was real, the skill was real, and the outcomes for guests who experienced the best of what was tradition offered was genuinely extraordinary. And the labor was real, and the hardship was real, and the beauty of the result was rested on a foundation of sustained human effort that the beauty of result could sometimes obscure. This tension, present in every form of care work in every culture in every period, does not diminish the care. If anything, it deepens it. The innkeeper who prepared your bath and calibrated your room and listened to the garden she had helped to compose was doing something extraordinary in circumstances that were not easy. The care was not given from a position of ease and abundance. It was given deliberately, skillfully, from a deep understanding of what the human being in her care needed, and from the choice made night after night to provide it regardless of the cost to herself. This is the hidden layer of tonight's history, the layer that the great mother archetype carries beneath its surface warmth. The care that holds you tonight is not effortless, it is chosen, and chosen care, care that is offered from knowledge and skill and deliberate intention rather than a simple abundance, is the most nourishing kind there is. Not all the travelers on the Edo Road were merchants or officials. Some of the most important figures in the inn's history were the pilgrims. The Japan in the Edo period was a country of pilgrimages. The great routes of the Ise to Shikoku's 88 temples, to the mountain shrines of Nikko and Dewa Sanzan, carries a constant stream of people who were traveling not for commerce or for government service, but for something harder to categorize. The specific combination of spiritual seeking and physical challenge, and the deliberate removal from ordinary life that the pilgrimage in every culture has offered to people who needed something that ordinary life could not provide. The Shikoku pilgrimage, the Ohenro-san, the circuit of 88 temples on the island of Shikoku associated with the Buddhist saint Kobu Dashi, was and remains one of the longest and most demanding walking routes in Asia, approximately 1,200 kilometers, typically walked over 40 to 60 days, depending on pace and physical condition, through mountain passes and coastal paths and inland valleys, in all weathers, by people ranging from the young and athletic to the elderly and infirm. The pilgrims who walked the Ohenro wore white, the white of the shroud, the white of the person who has, for the duration of the pilgrimage, accepted that they are already in some sense dead to their ordinary life, already in transit, already between the person they were and the whatever they will become. They carried a staff, the kongozu, understood as the physical presence of Kobodaishi walking with them. They chanted sutras at every temple. They slept wherever they could. And the tradition of setai, the giving of gifts and hospitality to pilgrims by ordinary people along the route, meant that they were often received into private homes and roadside inns with a specific quality of care that went beyond ordinary hospitality. To receive a pilgrim was to receive Kobodashi himself, the tradition held. The exhausted, weather beaten person who appeared at your gate in white robes was not simply a traveler in need of shelter. They were carrying something, the specific quality of an intention, of sustained spiritual effort, of the particular vulnerability that comes from being genuinely being between one state and another that made their presence in your inn a kind of gift rather than merely a transaction. The innkeeper who understood this received the pilgrim differently than she received the merchant or the official, not with less care, if anything, with more, but with a different quality of it. The merchant or the official arrived with their social identity intact and required that identity be honored and accommodated. The pilgrim arrived with their social identity deliberately suspended, shed along with their ordinary clothes, and required something that social accommodation could not provide. They required simply to be held, not organized, not managed, not assessed and served according to their status, simply received as a person in transit, a person in the middle of something, a person who had been walking in white for 30 days or 40 days or salvers how many days it has been, carrying the staff and the sutras and the specific weight of whatever had brought them to the road in the first place. The pilgrim's road was prepared with a particular quality of emptiness, less rather than more. The tokonoma might hold nothing at all, or a single object of very simple presence, a stone, a leaf, something that made no demands on the attention and offered no interpretation. The meal was plain and nourishing, and without the sequence of impressions that the merchant's dinner provided, because the pilgrim's mind was already so full of impression, had been receiving impression from the road for so many consecutive days that more impression was not what was needed. What was needed was the stillness at the center of things, the quality of the inn's care that existed beneath its technique, beneath its skill, beneath all the calibration and consideration. The simple fact of being received, of someone having made a space for you, having warmed it, having anticipated your arrival and prepared for it with care in a world that had been asking you all day and every day to continue moving, to cover the next kilometer, to reach the next temple, to all be always in transit and never arrived. The inn was arrived. For one night you were not between one place and another. You were here, in this room, in this warmth, under this futon that smelled of the sun and of cotton and of the specific quality of care that had gone into its preparation. The pilgrim slept deeply. The historical record is consistent on this point across many different accounts by many different pilgrims on many different routes. The sleep in the inn after the accumulated days on the road was often described as the deepest sleep of the pilgrimage, deeper even than the sleep that came from simple physical exhaustion. Something about being received, genuinely received, in a specific way that the best inns receive their guests, produced the quality of rest that physical depletion alone could not. The scholars who had studied these accounts suggest that what the pilgrims was experiencing was the physiological and psychological effect of being held by something outside themselves, of surrendering for one night the sustained effort of self management that pilgrimage demanded, the monitoring of one's own state, the management of one's own needs, and the maintenance of a spiritual practice in the face of physical hardship to something external that would manage it on their behalf. The inn as the great mother, the pilgrimage, the, The pilgrim as the child who has been carrying too much for too long and who find themselves finally in the right arms simply lets go. Here is the part of the story that the guest never saw. After the last guest had been settled and the rooms had gone quiet, and the sounds of the inn had reduced to the minimum that the night required, the innkeeper began her own evening. It was late, considerably later than the guests who had been in their futons for an hour or two already. Her feet, which had been carrying her through the inn since before dawn, ached in a way what she had long since simply learned to register without attending to. Her back held the accumulated weight of a day of sustained physical and emotional labor that was, in its demands, not so different from the merchants and pilgrims she had spent the day receiving. The road's demands were simply the inn's demands by another name. She made her rounds, not to check on the guests. That was not its primary purpose, though she would have noticed anything requiring attention. The rounds were a practice, a way of moving through the inn in its sleeping state and registering, with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, the condition of each room, each corridor, each element of the building that her care maintained. She walked quietly. The wooden corridors of a traditional Japanese building have a specific quality of sound. They creak inevitably under the weight of a footstep, and the skilled innkeeper had learned over years which boards creaked and how to distribute her weight to minimize the sound. Her movement through the sleeping inn was almost silent, not because she was performing stealth, but because she had simply learned through long practice how to move in a space without disturbing it. She paused outside each room, not entering, only listening. The quality of breathing, audible through the paper screens, told her what she needed to know. The guest, this guest was deeply asleep, the breath slow and even and completely unconscious. That guest was still on the surface. The breath slightly irregular, the occasional shift of position audible. The pilgrim in the small room at the end of the corridor was breathing with the specific quality of someone who had finally, after days on the road, arrived somewhere safe enough to stop managing themselves. She noted each of these things without recording them. They would inform tomorrow's preparations, would adjust tomorrow's calibrations. The guest who was sleeping lightly tonight would receive a slightly different morning, a breakfast of slightly more warmth and substance. The fire in the brazier banged against the early morning cold for slightly longer than usual. After the rounds, she sat in the kitchen, usually where the last warmth of the cooking fire still lingered in the thick clay of the oven. She sat with tea, not with the careful, considerate tea of the guest's meal, but ordinary tea poured without ceremony into a working cup, drunk while she sat in the working kitchen among the working objects in the inn's domestic life. And here in the kitchen, in the late quiet of the sleeping inn, something happened that is perhaps the most important thing in tonight's story and the least visible. She rested, not sleep, not yet, but the specific quality of rest that comes after sustained, genuine care had been given and received, the quality of a person who has emptied themselves in good service and who is, in the quiet of the kitchen, receiving back what the service cost, not through any dramatic or mystical mechanism, simply through the quality of the silence and warmth and the knowledge that the things she had worked to provide had been provided, that somewhere in the inn, in the rooms she had prepared and the meals she had cooked and the baths she had drawn, human beings were sleeping in a specific way that she had worked to make possible. She has held them, and in the holding, something of what they had released had become available to her too. The stillness that she had created for them was also her stillness. The warmth of the rooms she had heated was also her warmth. The quality of care she had given all day had not, as fear of exhaustion might suggest, depleted her, but had, in the mysterious economy of genuine giving, returned to her in a form that was different from what she had been given, but was nourishing in its own way. This is what the Edo period tradition understood about the relationship between the innkeeper and the inn's guest that is hardest to articulate and most important to know. It was not a relationship of simple transaction, service given in exchange for payment received. It was a reciprocal holding. The innkeeper held the guests through the night, and the successful discharge of that holding, the sight of the sleeping pilgrim, the sound of the merchant's even breath, the knowledge that the preparations had been correct, held the innkeeper in return. She drank her tea. The inn slept around her. Outside, the garden continued its sonic work. The water falling, the bamboo breathing, the occasional knock of the deer scarer against its stone. She had heard these sounds so many thousand times that they had long since moved past the level of conscious hearing and simply became the texture of the night, the auditory equivalent of the warmth of the kitchen, present and reliable and asking nothing of her. Eventually, she too would sleep on her own futon, in her own small room on the back of the inn, in the hours between the guests' last settling and the first light that would call her to begin again. Her sleep was shorter than theirs and less elaborate in its preparation, but it was in its way just as deep. She had earned it. The Edo Period Inn did not offer the same sleep in January than it offered in July. This seems obvious, but it is worth dwelling on because the modern sleep environment tends toward a studied indifference to season, temperature control to a consistent standard year round. The same mattress, the same pillow, the same quality of darkness and silence in every month. The season outside is relevant only insofar as it is kept outside, managed, and excluded by insulation and climate control. The Edo Inn operated on a different principle entirely. The season was not excluded, it was incorporated. The preparation for sleep changed not only between the major seasons, but between the minor transitions between them. The point in autumn when the nights became cold enough to require different charcoal management. The point in spring when the garden shifted from its winter sparseness to its first tentative green. The specific few weeks of the cherry blossom where the tree outside the sleeping room was neither bare nor full, but in its extraordinary brief middle state of becoming. In high summer, the preparations were an inversion of what we have been describing tonight. The futon was replaced by a lighter cover, sometimes only a single layer of cotton, sometimes linen, cooler to the touch and less insulating. The hibachi was not lit. Instead, the screens to the garden were opened more widely, inviting the night air in, and the sound of the garden was more prominent. Cicadas in the trees rather than bamboo in the wind. The sound of a summer night that was completely different from this autumn one in its character. its temperature, its species. Summer sleep in the Edo Inn was about coolness. The bath was drawn at a slightly lower temperature. The meal was lighter, cold preparations, food that cooled the body from the inside, and the specific foods that the Japanese tradition understood as belonging to the summer heat: cold soba noodles, chilled tofu, cucumber prepared with vinegar and sesame oil. The room was prepared for the passage of air rather than a retention of warmth. Mosquito nets, the kaya, were hung under over the sleeping area in summer, their fine gauze creating an enclosure within the room's enclosure. This was practical. Mosquitoes in Edo period carried the disease as well as producing discomfort, but it also had a quality of the sleeping alcove, the created inner space that served the same function as the drawn screens of winter. The net enclosed the sleeper, gave them boundaries, created the specific intimate scale that the human body sought in sleep. In winter, the preparation was its own art. The futon's upper layer was the heaviest of the year, sometimes supplemented with a second cover for the coldest nights. The additional weight increasing the body's sense of being held to a level that produced, in some guests, an almost immediate drowsiness. The hibachi was the most important element of the room, its management through the long winter nights demanding the most careful calibration of all the seasonal variations. A winter tradition in some regions was the use of the yutampo, a ceramic or metal vessel filled with hot water and placed inside the futon near the feet. The feet, which had been in straw sandals on cold roads all day, were often the last part of the body to warm and the first to grow cold again in sleep. Warm feet were understood by the Edo period tradition as essential to the onset of sleep. The body's temperature regulation system, which drops the core temperature to initiate sleep, works most efficiently when the extremities are warm enough to allow peripheral vasodilation, releasing heat from the body's surface and allowing the core to cool. This is again a physiological mechanism that modern science, sleep science, has documented in detail. The warm feet facilitate the core cooling that triggers on sleep onset. The Edo period innkeeper knew none of this mechanistically. She knew it practically, that the guest with cold feet lay awake longer than the guest with warm feet, and that the yutampo, placed correctly in the futon at the right temperature an hour before the guest retired, produced better sleep outcomes than all but the most extreme other interventions. Spring was perhaps the most subtle season for the inn's sleep preparation. The transition from winter to spring in Japan is gradual and not linear. Warm days interrupted by cold returns, and the cherry blossoms appearing before the warmth is reliable, the body uncertain of what it needs. The spring preparations require the most flexibility, the most moment to moment adjustment, the most genuine attention to what specific day and specific guest required, rather than what the season in the abstract suggested. It was said among Edo period innkeepers that spring revealed the quality of the practitioner most clearly, that anyone could prepare a winter room or summer room correctly, but that the spring room required something more than knowledge. It required the kind of presence that knew when to apply the rule and when to abandon it in favor of what was actually needed. Tonight is autumn. The preparations we have been describing, the hot bath, the weighted futon, the banked charcoal, the garden of bamboo and water, are autumn's preparations, the correct preparations for a night that is cold at its edges and warm at its center. A night that smells of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke and a particular freshness of air that has been carrying warmth all day and now, at its depth, carries only stars. The season is correct for what you need. The inn knows what season it is. There is something in the Japanese room that cannot be named by pointing to any object within it. The tatami, the tokonoma, the screen, the futon, the hibachi, the single maple branch. These can all be pointed to, described, understood as individual elements of the space, but the quality that the room makes the room what it is, the quality that produces in the person lying in the futon, the specific effects of genuine rest, is not located in any of these objects. It is located in what is between them. The Japanese concept of ma, most often translated as negative space or interval or pause, refers to the meaningful void, the gap between things, the silence between notes, the empty space in a composition that gives the non empty space its meaning. Ma is not the absence of content, it is the content of a different kind, content whose nature is to be perceived only in relation to what surrounds it, to be felt rather than seen, to be understood as the condition that makes everything else possible. In the Edo period in Rome, Ma was not aesthetic affection or a philosophical gesture. It was a functional requirement. The room worked, produced its effects on the sleeping body and the settling mind, precisely because of what was not in it. The room contained no excess. Every object was there because it needed to be there, placed with precision that was not formal but was deeply considered. The tokonoma held one thing, not three. The hibachi was at the corner, unobtrusive, not at the center. The futon was laid on the floor, not elevated on a platform, not surrounded by furniture. The screen was not covered in decoration but was plain white paper, its value residing entirely in its capacity to transmit light softly and to divide interior from exterior without completely separating them. Between these objects and around them, Ma, space that was not empty in the sense of being unused or neglected, but that was precisely open, available, not filled with anything that would require the occupant's attention, not presenting any visual demand that the occupied mind would need to process and respond to. This quality of the room gave the tired mind somewhere to go, not somewhere to go in the sense of a direction, not toward the tokonoma, not toward the screen, but somewhere to go in the sense of a condition of not having to look at anything, not having to process anything, not having to respond to or manage or evaluate anything. The ma of the room was a space then in which the mind could become temporarily and genuinely empty. Not empty in the distressing sense of blankness or absence, empty in the way that a held breath before a deep exhale is empty, a fullness of stillness, a completion of readiness, the moment just before something becomes possible that could not have been possible while the room was full. Modern sleep environments often make the mistake of excess. Too much stimulation in the colors and textures and objects. Too many choices presented to the eye, which is always seeking and sorting and evaluating even when the mind believes it is at rest. The screen of the phone glowing at the bedside, offering infinity. The ceiling fixture whose light source is visible, creating a point of brightness in the sky that the eye cannot entirely release. The Edo period inn offered none of this. Its ma was protective. The space around and the between the room's objects was not empty of meaning, but full of particular kind of meaning. The meaning of a space that had been prepared with a specific intention of holding a human being at rest, and that had removed everything that would prevent that rest. You feel the ma of the room from inside the futon, not as an absence, as spaciousness, as the quality of being in a room that is making no claims on you, asking none of nothing of you, directing your attention nowhere in particular and everywhere in general, and therefore effectively inward toward the only thing that remains when the external world had been gracefully, carefully set aside. The only thing that remains is you, not the social you, not the roads used or the inn's guests or the travelers who had covered these kilometers over these days. The you that exists before any of those descriptions and after all of them. The you that the pilgrims in white were walking toward and the merchants were trying underneath their collections to remember. The you and the bath began to uncover and the meal continued and the room is completing. The ma of the room holds you in relation to yourself, and in that relation, something settles. Before the dissolve takes us completely, let us look briefly at the morning. The Edo period in understood the departure as the completion of the hospitality, not its ending. The way a piece of music does not end when its final note sounds, but continues for the duration of the silence that follows. The silence that is still part of the music, that gives the last note its full weight, that belongs to the composition as surely as any sound it contains. The morning preparation at the inn was considered as the evening's. The small fire in the room, already burning when you woke, the apprentice had entered quietly while you were still asleep and lit it. The sound of water heating in the kitchen, the specific quality of early morning light through the paper screen, cooler and more silver than evening's amber, the light of a world that is still becoming rather than a world in full possession of itself. The morning meal was different from the evenings in every dimension, lighter, plainer. The morning appetite was not the complex appetite of a person who had refueled by sleep and was ready for richness. It was a simpler, more direct hunger for warmth, for something plain and substantial, for the specific reassurance that the day was beginning well. Rice, miso soup, slightly simpler than the previous evenings, its contents more basic. Pickled vegetables, grilled fish if the inn had fresh fish that morning, tea, stronger than a night's tea, its warmth and slight bitterness a signal that a different quality of time was beginning. The innkeeper appeared in the morning with the same quality of attention she had brought to the evening, but calibrated differently. The evening's attention was oriented toward releasing, toward helping the guests settle down when the road had imposed. The morning's attention was oriented toward receiving, toward helping the guests pick up what they would need for the next stage of the journey. She noticed how they had slept, not by asking. Guests were not typically asked how they were slept, but the question created the obligation to produce a socially acceptable answer might not correspond to the actual experience. She noticed by observation. The face of someone who had slept deeply looked different from the face of someone who had slept poorly. And the difference was not only in the freshness of the skin, but in the quality of presence. The eyes that were fully there versus the eyes that were managing something residual, something unresolved from the night. She noted this and carried it forward. not for this guest who was departing, but for every future guest. Every guest who passed through the inn taught her something. Every face in the morning was feedback. Every quality of sleep achieved or not achieved was information about what had worked and what had not, about where the evening's preparations had been precisely correct and where they might be improved. This is how the tradition refined itself over generations, not through theory or deliberate experiment, but through the accumulated observations of hundreds of mornings and hundreds of departing faces, each one a small lesson in what the human body and the human spirit needed in the hours of the night. You rise, dress, fold the yukata, and leave it on the futon the way you had been shown. Your pack, which the apprentice had aired while you slept, is waiting at the entrance. Its weight somehow less this morning than it was yesterday evening, though nothing had been removed from it. The road ahead is the same road it was when you arrived. The kilometer has not shortened, but you are different. The specific quality of having been being held overnight, of having been received, prepared for, cared for without it managing you, of having slept in a space built precisely around what you needed, is in your body now, in the muscles that are not carrying yesterday's tension, in the mind that is not managing yesterday's residue, in the face that the correct innkeeper sees the departure and read as yes, that was correct. That was enough. You bow at the gate, she bows in return. The same deep, present bow that received you at arrival, completing the gesture of hospitality, framing the night between two moments of genuine attention. The gate closes behind you. The road is there, and you carry in your body now the specific quality of a night well held. Let us listen now without commentary. The inn at its deepest hour, the water in the garden basin, falling, falling, falling. Its sound is not the same from one moment to the next. The flow varies slightly with the wind that moves the bamboo spout, and the surface of the water in the basin varies from what is fallen into it, and the sound was produced for by each drop varies from where it lands in relation to the surface. No 2 seconds of the sound are identical. It is continuous without being repetitive. It fills the acoustic space of sleeping in with a texture of sound so familiar by now. You have been hearing it since before you passed through the gate, that it has ceased to be something you hear and becomes simply the quality of the air. The bamboo in the garden, dark, its stems invisible from the futon, but its sound arriving through the open thread of the skin. A dry, complex sound, but each stem a different note, each leaf contributing its fraction of the whole. The wind tonight is light, barely enough to be felt on the skin, but enough for the bamboo. The bamboo requires almost nothing to speak. The slightest movement of the air is sufficient. It is one of the most responsive plants in the world to the presence of air, and in that responsiveness, it makes audible what would otherwise be imperceptible. The fact that the air is moving, that the night is not perfectly still, that there is a gentle and continuous exchange between the inside of the inn and the outside world. The deer scarer, its intervals are irregular. You have stopped anticipating the knock. Your mind tried to find the pattern for a while and then, finding none that held, released the attempt and allowed the sounds to arrive without prediction. The knock arrives, silence, the sound of water refilling. Knock arrives again, different interval. You do not expect it. It simply comes, and its coming is a small, clean event in the quiet, a moment of definition in the formlessness of the late night, like a single brushstroke on a painting that is mostly empty space. The hibachi, you cannot hear it exactly. You can hear the quality of the room that the hibachi produces, the slight dryness of the air, the evenness of the warmth, the absence of the sound that the cold makes, which is not a sound at all, but is perceptible in its absence. A room with a hibachi in has has a different silence than a room without one. A warm silence has a presence, a density. It contains the small sounds, the occasional infinitesimal shift of charcoal settling into itself, so small it below the threshold of normal hearing, but present in the body as a very slight vibration that the cold silence does not. Your own breathing, slower than it was when you arrived at the gate, slower than it was at dinner, slower than it was in the bath, even where the steam had deepened it. Now in the futon, in the dark, in the inns held quiet, it has found a pace that belongs to no activity, no effort, no management. It simply is the breath of a body that has been received and is now genuinely at rest. Listen to it. In, out, in, out. Somewhere in the inn, a door slides very quietly on its track. The soft sound of the innkeeper moving through her sleeping house, her footsteps almost silent on the polished wood, a pause, the quality of someone standing still and listening to the quality of the rooms around her, reading the night the way she reads everything with full, unhurried attention. And then she moves on, her footsteps receding, a door sliding closed, the sound of the inn settling back into its full quiet. You were heard, you are known, you are held. Let the words come very slowly now. The futon weighs what a futon that has been aired in the autumn summer weighs. It weighs the specific weight of care, of the decision made this morning by someone who does not know you and will never know you in the way that people who share a life know each other, but who's prepared the specific thing for the specific night with a quality of attention that is in its own terms, a form of love. The room is the right size. The garden is saying what it says. You have been on the road for many days, not necessarily the Tokaido, not necessarily any road that had been walked in straw sandals, but the road that we all of us are on, the long daily road of being a person in the world, of managing the performances of ourselves in relation to others, of carrying what we carry on from where we were toward to where we are going. Tonight you have arrived somewhere, not your destination, not the end of the world, simply a place where the road stops for a night and someone was waiting at the gate and the bath was the right temperature and the meal was the right sequence and the room was the right size and the futon was the right weight and the garden is saying the right thing. You don't no need to manage anything. You do not need to hold anything together. The inn is holding it. The innkeeper has made her rounds. She has heard your breathing. She has noted that what she needed to note. She has moved on. In the kitchen, her tea is cooling. The garden's water is falling. The charcoal in the night is doing its slow, patient work. Everything that needed to be prepared has been prepared. Everything that needed to be attended to has been attended to. What remains now is only this, the futon, the warmth, the sound of water falling in the dark, the bamboo breathing, your own breath, slow and deep and completely your own, moving through a body that has been tonight genuinely held. You do not need to do anything with this. You do not need to understand it or remember it or make it into anything it is not already. It simply is what it is. The inn, the night, the sound of the garden makes everything else is quiet. And you here, held, rest now. The road will be there in the morning. Tonight, only this. The water falls. The bamboo breathes. Sleep, sleep, sleep.